Some towns forget what justice means, until a stranger rides in to remind them. "Don't let him hurt me," whispered the little girl. The words trembled through the wind, small and breaking, barely louder than the rattle of a loose shutter in the late afternoon dust. Ash Hollow lay still under the weight of the summer sun, its single street bleached pale and quiet. The air smelled of smoke and horse sweat. A stray tumbleweed bumped along the boardwalk and caught against a post. Behind the saloon, a girl no older than 8 crouched between 2 barrels. Her face was streaked with dirt, her lip split. She hugged a small rag doll to her chest. Every time the saloon door swung open, she flinched. Then the sound of boots, slow, measured, crunched against the dirt road. A rider had just come in from the ridge, hat low, coat dusty from the trail. The horse beneath him, a bay with a white blaze, looked near spent. The man guided it down the street without a word, passing the general store, the livery, the church whose bell hadn't rung in months. He stopped when he saw the girl. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim. "You lost, little one?" His voice was quiet, rough with travel. The girl shook her head fast, gripping her doll tighter. "Don't let him hurt me," she whispered again. Before the man could speak, the saloon doors slammed open. A large man stumbled out, drunk and red-faced, his vest stained with whiskey. "Annie," he bellowed. "Where'd you run off to?" The girl shrank further into the shadows. The rider's hand drifted to the holster at his side. The drunk man, Carl Benton, the town's foreman, glared around the street, his boots thudding across the porch. "You seen a little girl?" He barked at the rider. The cowboy's jaw flexed once. "Can't say I have." Benton squinted, suspicion clouding his drunken stare. "She's mine," he muttered. "Needs a lesson for running off." The wind shifted, lifting dust between them. The cowboy didn't move. The silence stretched thin. "Reckon she's had enough lessons for one day," the cowboy said finally. Benton's face twisted. "You don't know who you're talking to, stranger." "This town runs on my say-so. Best you remember that." The cowboy said nothing, just stood there, his shadow falling over the man's boots. After a long, tense moment, Benton spat to the side and staggered back into the saloon, muttering under his breath. The street went still again. The girl peeked out from behind the barrels, eyes wide and glistening. "Thank you," she said, barely a whisper. The cowboy gave a slow nod. "You got someplace to be?" She shook her head. He says he's my pa, but he's not. He hurts me when I don't call him that." The cowboy's gaze darkened. He knelt to her level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Annie," she said. He tipped his hat. "Name's Jed." The girl looked toward the saloon door where the noise had started up again. Laughter, a breaking bottle, the muffled sound of a piano. Jed stood and looked down the empty street. "You best stay close for now." He led his horse toward the livery, Annie walking beside him, her small hand clutching his coat. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the town. The sound of hammering stopped somewhere down the road, leaving only the wind and the creak of a hanging sign. As they passed the sheriff's office, the door opened. Sheriff Clay stepped out, his badge dull with dust. "New in town?" he asked. "Just passing through," Jed said. The sheriff's eyes shifted to Annie, then back to Jed. "If you're wise, you'll keep it that way. Benton doesn't take kindly to strangers meddling in his business." Jed looked past him toward the horizon, where the light had turned the dust into gold. Sometimes a man's business needs meddling. He led the girl onward, the sound of their steps fading into the evening wind. The door of the sheriff's office swung shut behind them with a hollow thud. The next morning came pale and cold, the kind of dawn that made the world seem tired. Ash Hollow was quiet, save for a few wagons rolling toward the mine and the crow of a restless rooster behind the stables. Jed Lawson sat on a stool outside the livery, mending a torn saddle strap. Annie sat nearby, legs tucked under her, tracing lines in the dust with a stick. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks still marked with bruises. "You sleep at any?" Jed asked without looking up. "A little," she said softly. "I dreamed about Pa." He paused, setting the strap aside. "Your real Pa?" She nodded. "He worked the mine till Mr. Benton came. Then Pa didn't come home?" Jed's eyes lifted. "What did they say happened?" Annie's voice trembled. "They said there was a cave-in, but Pa's friend Mr. Cole told Mama the tunnel was fine. He said Pa found gold, then he went missing too." Jed leaned back, his jaw tightening. He'd heard stories like that before. Men disappearing when money got involved and the law looking the other way. A wagon rolled by and the driver gave Jed a long, cautious look before steering clear. Folks in Ash Hollow had learned not to ask questions. "Stay put," Jed said finally, standing. "I'll get us something to eat." He walked toward the general store, his spurs clicking softly. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old wood. The storekeeper, a thin man with worried eyes, froze when Jed entered. "Morning," Jed said. "Need biscuits, jerky, and a canteen." The man nodded quickly, gathering the items. "You're the cowboy that stood up to Benton yesterday," he muttered under his breath. "Folks are talking. Good or bad?" Jed asked. "Mostly scared," the storekeeper said. "Benton runs this town. Sheriff just keeps the peace for him." Jed placed a few coins on the counter. "That so?" The storekeeper hesitated, then leaned closer. "You best ride out before sundown, mister. Benton doesn't forgive, especially not when he's been embarrassed in front of his men." Jed picked up the supplies and gave a slight nod. "Appreciate the warning." Outside, he found Annie sitting on the steps, her doll propped beside her. "We eatin'?" she asked hopefully. "Yeah," Jed said, handing her a biscuit. "Then we're finding someplace quiet." They walked to the edge of town, settling near the old blacksmith shop, a place long abandoned after the forge went cold. The roof sagged, but it kept off the sun. As Annie ate, Jed scanned the horizon. "That man, Benton, he got anyone who stands up to him." She shook her head. "Mama tried. He sent the sheriff to take her away." Jed's hand stilled. "Take her where?" "Don't know. I ain't seen her since." Annie's voice cracked and she stared down at her doll. Jed's chest tightened. He'd seen evil before, but something about this child's quiet pain made it different. It wasn't just cruelty. It was cowardice, the kind that infected whole towns. By noon, the heat rose heavy again. Jed fixed the saddle strap and tied his horse near the shop. Annie had dozed off in the shade, her hand still holding her doll. A shadow fell over them. Sheriff Clay stood in the doorway, hat low. "Didn't figure you'd stay," he said. "Didn't figure you'd care." Jed replied evenly. Clay sighed. "You don't understand, Lawson. Benton owns the payroll, the mine, and half the land from here to the ridge. Folks rely on him. You cross him, you don't just make trouble, you make widows." Jed looked at the sleeping girl. "Seems to me that's already happening." The sheriff's mouth tightened. "You're not going to save her. Leave it alone." Jed rose slowly, his shadow tall across the dirt. "I tried that once. Didn't sit right then either." Clay studied him for a long moment. "You'll regret it." "Maybe," Jed said. "But not today." The sheriff turned and walked off, boots echoing against the empty street. Jed watched him go, then looked down at Annie, sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knew how long. The light outside the doorway flickered as a cloud passed. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the hills. Something was coming, and Jed Lawson wasn't leaving. By evening, the sky above Ash Hollow burned red with dust and smoke. The mine whistle had long gone silent, yet no one lingered in the streets. Windows were shuttered, doors locked. The town breathed like a man holding fear in his chest. Jed sat by the cold forge in the old blacksmith shop, turning a tin cup in his hands. Annie was beside him, warming herself by a small fire he'd built from scrap wood. The flames flickered over her face, softening the bruises. "You ever think of leaving this place?" Jed asked quietly. Annie looked up. "I can't. Mama always said Pa's gold was still here somewhere. Said it was ours." Jed frowned. "Gold's a curse to most who find it." She said it'd make us free, Annie whispered. Outside, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden. Jed set the cup down and stood, hand drifting toward his gun. He moved to the window, peering through the gap in the boards. Two men walked down the road, dark shapes against the fading light. They stopped near the saloon where Benton's voice carried loud and ugly. "Find the girl," Benton barked, "and the drifter with her. He's got a big mouth and a hero's death waitin'." Jed pulled back from the window, his jaw set hard. "Looks like trouble found us first." Annie's eyes widened. "Will they come here?" "Maybe," he said. "But not tonight." He put out the fire with his boot, plunging the room into dim light. Then he opened a loose plank in the wall and pointed. "There's a crawl space back there. If I say hide, you do it fast, you hear?" Annie nodded. He waited until her breathing steadied again before sitting back down, pulling his hat low. The wind howled outside, scattering grit across the porch. Not long after, a knock came. A light one, cautious. Jed drew his revolver and moved to the door. "Who is it?" A voice whispered back. "Name's Ruth. I work at the cafe." Jed hesitated, then opened the door just enough. A woman in her 40s stood there, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face carried the same tired look most folks in Ash Hollow wore. "I saw you stand up to Benton," she said quickly. "You got more backbone than the sheriff ever did." Jed studied her. "You risked coming here for a reason." "Speak it." She glanced over her shoulder. "The girl's telling the truth. Her pa, Samuel Graves, did strike gold in that mine. Benton and his men killed him for it. The sheriff helped cover it up. They buried the claim papers somewhere in Benton's office." Jed's eyes narrowed. "You sure?" Ruth nodded.
"I was there the night they brought his body out."
Said it was an accident, but his hands were tied. For a moment only the wind answered. Then Jed said, "Why tell me?" "Because someone needs to stop him," she said. "The rest of us are too scared." Annie had woken and was listening quietly. "Can we prove it?" she asked. Ruth gave her a small sad smile. "If you find those papers, yes." Jed looked at the woman. "You got any idea where he keeps them?" "In the back room of his office. Locked desk drawer." Jed gave a slow nod. "That's all I need." Ruth hesitated at the door. "Be careful. Benton's not the kind to forgive a man twice." When she was gone, Jed turned to Annie. "We'll get your pa's papers, but you stay here." "No," Annie said fiercely. "He'll kill you." Jed gave a faint smile. "Not if I'm faster." He strapped on his gun belt, checked the cylinder, and stepped into the deep red light outside. The air carried a taste of iron and rain. "Lock the door behind me," he said. Annie watched him disappear down the dusty street, the glow of the saloon flickering in the distance like a warning. Back inside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. Annie held her doll close and whispered a prayer she half remembered. And far down the street, Benton's laughter echoed, cruel and certain, unaware that before the next sunrise, his empire of fear would begin to crack. Night had fully settled over Ash Hollow. The moon hung low, pale as bone, casting long shadows between the crooked buildings. The town looked almost peaceful, if not for the sound of boots and muffled laughter spilling from Benton's saloon. Jed moved quietly down the back alley, staying close to the walls. The smell of spilled whiskey and gun oil filled the air. Somewhere behind him, a coyote howled across the hills. He paused, checked his revolver, and kept going. Benton's office sat above the saloon, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Two men stood at the bottom of the stairs, rifles slung loose but ready. Jed watched from the dark for a long moment, counting the seconds between their movements. When one of them turned to spit, Jed moved, silent as the wind. He came up behind the man and struck him hard across the head with the butt of his gun. The man dropped without a sound. The other barely turned before Jed's revolver was leveled at his chest. "Don't," Jed said softly. The guard froze, eyes wide. Jed motioned with his gun toward the saloon doors. "Go inside. Stay there till you forget my face." The man obeyed, stumbling into the building. Jed climbed the stairs 2 at a time, Inside Benton's office, the lamplight flickered over stacks of ledgers and maps. The air smelled of cigar smoke and ink. He shut the door behind him and crossed to the desk. He pulled at the drawer. Locked. From his pocket, he took a thin knife and worked the latch until it gave with a quiet click. Inside were papers, contracts, mine reports, payroll lists, and beneath them a folded document marked Claim Number 47, Samuel Graves. Jed unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. The claim was signed, sealed, and dated just days before the so-called cave-in, proof that Benton had stolen everything. He slipped the paper into his coat and turned to leave. Then a voice came from the doorway. "You sure you want to do that, Cowboy?" Benton stood there, half drunk, a pistol in his hand and a cruel smile twisting his face. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Jed didn't answer. Benton stepped closer, waving the pistol. "That girl ain't your concern. She's mine. Everything in this town is mine. Men like you ride in, stir up trouble, and get themselves buried." Jed's voice stayed calm. "Maybe. But men like you always dig their own graves first." Benton's smile vanished. The gun came up fast, but Jed was faster. His revolver fired once, the bullet hitting the lamp beside Benton. Flames burst across the wall, scattering sparks. Benton cursed and stumbled back as the fire caught the curtains. Jed turned and leaped down the stairs, the papers still clutched in his coat. He hit the street running. Behind him, smoke poured from the upstairs window. People were shouting now, rushing into the road as the saloon began to burn. He didn't stop until he reached the blacksmith's shop. Annie ran to him as soon as he appeared. "Jed!" she cried. "You're hurt." A streak of blood ran along his arm, shallow but bleeding. "Just a scratch," he said, catching his breath. "But we've got what we came for." He pulled out the folded claim and placed it in her hands. "Your pa's truth. No one can bury it now." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "What'll happen to Benton?" Jed looked toward the glow rising over the town. Fire has a way of cleaning things. Suddenly a sharp crack split the night, a gunshot. The bullet slammed into the post beside Jed's head. He grabbed Annie and dove behind the forge. Benton's men were already pouring into the street, guns drawn, faces lit by firelight. "Find them," someone shouted. "Benton wants the papers." Jed crouched low. Time to move. They slipped out the back and ran into the narrow trail behind the stables. The fire behind them roared higher, painting the town in orange and shadow. As they disappeared into the hills, Annie looked back once. The saloon that had ruled Ash Hollow for years was collapsing, timbers snapping under the flames. She turned to Jed. "Are we safe now?" "Not yet," he said, leading her toward the dark horizon. "But we're getting there, far behind them." Benton's furious shouting echoed over the crackle of fire, his empire of fear burning to ash, and for the first time in a long while, the wind that swept through Ash Hollow felt clean again. The night stretched long and cold as Jed and Annie made their way out of town. The fire behind them had faded to a dull orange glow, lighting the sky like a dying ember. Coyotes called in the distance, and the sound of gunfire had finally gone quiet. They reached a small rise overlooking Ash Hollow. From there, they could see the saloon burned to its frame and the streets below filled with people running buckets from the well. Benton's voice no longer echoed through the town. Only the crackle of fire and the cries of frightened horses filled the air. Jed tied his horse to a post and crouched beside Annie. "You cold?" She shook her head, though her small hands were trembling. "They'll come after us." "They'll try," Jed said. "But they'll have to find us first." He tore a piece from his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he scanned the dark valley below. "There's an old trail west of here. Miners used it before Benton shut the ridge down. We'll hole up there till morning." They walked for another hour through rocky paths and dry brush. The moonlight was faint, just enough to see the trail ahead. Annie grew tired, stumbling once or twice. Jed lifted her into his arms without a word. "Jed," she murmured, half asleep. "Why'd you help me?" He didn't answer right away. The crunch of gravel under his boots filled the silence. "Because somebody should have," he said finally. "And because I didn't once before." Annie tilted her head. Who? Jed's eyes darkened. My little boy, he died. While I was too busy fighting another man's war. Annie went quiet. She rested her head against his shoulder. Then maybe helping me makes it better, she said softly. Jed looked up at the stars, sharp and cold above the hills. Maybe it does. By dawn, they reached the old mining ridge. Rusted rails twisted through the rock and half-buried carts sat like ghosts of another time. Jed found a small shack still standing, its roof sagging but dry. This'll do, he said, setting Annie down. He checked the place, making sure no one had been there in years. Annie sat near the doorway, clutching her doll. Will the sheriff come? Jed loaded his revolver and holstered it again. If he's smart, he won't. But Benton's got pride, and men like that don't stop till they lose everything. He took the folded claim from his coat and spread it out on a crate. This here's proof of murder, theft, and lies. Enough to bring the whole town down on Benton's head, if anyone's brave enough to see it. Annie watched him, her voice small. Do you think anyone will listen? Jed sighed. They'll have to choose. Fear or truth. Sometimes both hurt just the same. Outside, the first light of morning touched the ridge. The valley below was quiet again. Smoke from the burned saloon drifted faintly in the distance. Jed stepped outside and stared toward the horizon. He'd seen this kind of town before, where one man's greed poisoned everything around him. But he'd also seen what happened when folks finally stood up. He turned back to Annie. When the sun's higher, I'll ride down. You'll stay here, you understand? She frowned. No, you said Benton's men. I'll handle them, Jed said, his voice firm but gentle. You've done your part. Now I do mine. She bit her lip, then nodded. Promise you'll come back? He met her eyes. I promise. As he saddled his horse, the wind carried faint sounds from the town. Angry voices, hammers striking metal, the noise of a place waking to trouble. Benton wasn't dead yet, and neither was his hold on Ash Hollow. Jed mounted up, checked his revolver once more, and looked back at the shack. Annie stood in the doorway, her small figure framed by morning light. Stay low, he said. I will, she whispered. Then he turned the horse toward the trail, the rising sun at his back. Dust rose behind him as he rode, one man against a town still chained by fear. And though he didn't look back, he knew the little girl was watching until he was gone. The sun climbed slowly over the hills, washing Ash Hollow in pale gold. Smoke still rose from the burned saloon, curling thin into the morning sky. The town looked quieter than usual, too quiet. Jed rode in steadily, his coat torn, his horse dusty from the trail. People peeked from behind curtains as he passed. A few men nodded, cautious and silent. They'd seen the fire. They'd heard the gunshots. But no one dared ask what it meant. He stopped outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Clay sat on the porch, hat in hand, eyes red from a sleepless night. You're a fool for coming back, Clay said tiredly. Maybe, Jed replied. But I've got proof now. He pulled the folded claim from his coat and dropped it onto the table beside the sheriff. Samuel Graves filed this before he was killed. Benton forged the records afterward. You knew it. Clay's face tightened. You think you're the first to tell me that? Half this town knows. But proof doesn't matter when fear runs deeper than law. Jed leaned forward. Then maybe it's time the law remembered what it's for. The sheriff met his eyes, guilt plain in them. If I stand up to him now, he'll kill me. Jed's voice was quiet but sharp as glass. He's killing this town already. Clay looked down at the paper again. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then the sheriff stood, sliding his gun belt around his waist. You'll need someone to back you up, won't you? Jed nodded once. That's the idea. Together they walked down the main street toward Benton's big house on the hill. The sound of their boots echoed through the silence. People started stepping out of doorways, watching them pass. Miners, shopkeepers, wives still in aprons. Ruth, the cafe woman, came forward. Is it true? She whispered. You have the proof? Jed handed her the claim. Make copies. Spread the word. Benton's done. She clutched the paper like something holy. God bless you, mister. By the time Jed and the sheriff reached the gate to Benton's yard, half the town was following behind them. Dust rose from the ground with every step, shimmering in the hot morning light. Benton stood on his porch, a bandage around his arm and hate in his eyes. A dozen of his hired men waited nearby, rifles ready. You just don't know when to quit, Benton growled. Jed stopped at the foot of the steps. You took a man's life and called it business. You lied to his child and called it mercy. Time you faced what you built, Benton laughed bitterly. You think these people will stand with you? They need me. Without me, this town dies. But as he looked past Jed, he saw faces, minors, widows, children, all standing in silence. No one stepped forward to help him. Sheriff Clay spoke up. Not anymore, Benton. It's over. Benton's hand went for his gun. The air snapped tight. Jed moved faster. His revolver cleared leather in one smooth motion. A single shot rang out. Benton froze, staring at the blood spreading across his chest. He staggered back, dropping his pistol, then fell against the porch rail. The silence that followed felt endless. Then someone whispered, "He's dead." Jed holstered his gun slowly. "No, he's finished." Benton groaned faintly, still breathing but broken. The sheriff knelt beside him, removing the gun from his limp hand. Jed turned to the crowd. "You all wanted justice. Now it's yours to keep. Don't let another man like him take it again." Ruth stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. "What about the girl?" "She's safe," Jed said. "She's got her father's truth and this town's hope." The people nodded, murmuring among themselves. For the first time in years, the air in Ash Hollow felt lighter. Jed looked at the sheriff. "You'll see the papers get to the circuit judge." Clay nodded. "I will. And I'll answer for my part in all this." Jed tipped his hat. "That's all a man can do." He turned back toward the open road, the wind lifting dust around his boots. Behind him, Benton's men dropped their guns one by one. The townsfolk gathered near the porch, not out of fear this time, but to make sure the past stayed buried for good. Jed mounted his horse, the saddle creaking softly. The crowd watched in silence as he started to ride away. Someone called out, "What's your name, mister?" Jed looked over his shoulder. "Lawson. Jed Lawson." And then he rode on, heading toward the ridge where a little girl was waiting. The wind had shifted by the time Jed reached the ridge again. The sky was turning gray, heavy with the smell of rain. He rode slowly, his arm aching from the fight, his coat streaked with dust and sweat. Annie was waiting in the doorway of the shack, her small figure framed by the dim light inside. When she saw him, she ran forward. "You came back," she cried, throwing her arms around him. Jed smiled faintly and lifted her. "Told you I would." She looked at him, eyes wide. "You're hurt." He glanced at the bandage tied around his arm. "Just a scrape. Nothing a little rest won't fix." Annie studied his face as if making sure he was telling the truth. "Did you stop him?" "Mr. Benton?" Jed set her down gently. "He won't hurt you or anyone again." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind sighed through the rocks, carrying the faint smell of rain and smoke. Annie reached for his hand. "Then we can go home?" Jed looked out across the valley. "You don't have a home there anymore, sweetheart." "Not the way it was. But maybe we can find you a new one." Annie's face fell. "I don't want to be alone again." Jed knelt so they were eye level. "You ain't alone. Not anymore. But you deserve a safe place. Folks who'll care for you properly." She bit her lip, trying not to cry. "I just want to stay with you." He smiled sadly. "You're something special, Annie, but a man like me, I'm not the staying kind. I ride where trouble is till it ain't." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then I'll pray you don't find trouble no more." Jed reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That'd be nice." A drizzle began to fall, soft against the tin roof. Inside the shack, the air smelled of dust and old iron. Jed built a small fire, its glow flickering warm across the walls. Annie sat close, watching the flames dance. "Tell me about my pa," she said quietly. "You read those papers, didn't you?" What did they say about him? Jed stared into the fire. Said he was an honest man. Worked hard. Didn't bow to bullies. That's why Benton went after him. Annie hugged her doll tighter. So he was brave. He was, Jed said. And you got that same kind of bravery in you. Outside, thunder rolled over the ridge. The sound made Annie flinch, but Jed's calm presence steadied her. He reached into his coat and took out a small gold locket. Found this near Benton's desk, he said, handing it to her. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a faded picture of her parents, her father holding her as a baby, her mother smiling beside him. Annie gasped softly. That's them. Jed nodded. They'd be proud of you. Her tears fell silently, but there was peace in her face now. She held the locket to her heart. For a while, the two sat in quiet. The rain thickened, tapping gently against the roof. Jed's thoughts drifted, to his boy, to the war, to every road that had led him here. He wondered if maybe, for once, he'd done something right. When the rain stopped, Annie had fallen asleep by the fire, her doll under one arm and the locket still clutched in her hand. Jed watched her for a long time, then stood, stepping outside. The sky had cleared, leaving stars scattered bright across the darkness. Down in the valley, Ash Hollow glimmered faintly under the moonlight, smoke rising like ghosts of the past. He took a deep breath. The air felt cleaner, lighter. Maybe the town would heal now. Maybe so would he. He looked back inside at the sleeping girl. A faint smile crossed his tired face. Rest easy, kid, he murmured. You're safe now. Then he sat beside the doorway, gun resting on his knee, and listened to the quiet night settle around them. For the first time in years, Jed Lawson felt something close to peace. The morning broke slowly and quietly. Mist clung to the trees, and the world felt washed clean after the night's rain. Jed woke stiff from where he'd dozed near the doorway. Annie was still asleep, curled beneath a blanket he'd draped over her. He stepped outside, stretching sore muscles. His horse Buck grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily. The sky was pale gold, the kind of morning that makes a man think maybe things can start over. Jed poured what was left of the coffee grounds into a pot, heating it over the fire. When Annie woke, she rubbed her eyes and smiled faintly at the smell. Morning, Jed said. You sleep all right? She nodded, yawning. I dreamed I was in a house with white curtains. My ma was there. She was smiling. Jed smiled softly. Sounds like a good dream. Can we find a house like that? She asked, her voice small but full of hope. Maybe, Jed said. Someplace quiet, close to folks who'll treat you right. Annie hesitated. Will you stay there too? He looked down, stirring the fire with a stick. I'll see you settled. Then I'll move on. Her face fell again. Because you don't want to stay? Jed took a deep breath. Because the kind of life I lead, it's not fit for a little girl. You need a home that lasts. She looked at him a long time, then whispered, You make me feel safe. Jed's throat tightened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured her a tin cup of coffee, weak and full of grit, the kind that tasted like mornings on the trail. They ate in silence. When they finished, Jed saddled Buck and tied Annie's small bundle of things behind the saddle horn. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, casting light across the open plain. The land spread wide and endless, dotted with scrub brush and the faint shimmer of far-off creeks. Annie watched everything with wide eyes. It's so big, she whispered. Jed nodded. Out here a person can lose the past if they ride long enough. They reached a fork in the trail near noon. One road led south toward the rail town of Garrison. The other wound west toward the mountains where Jed sometimes rode to trade pelts. He stopped at the crossroads. Annie looked up at him. Which way? Garrison, he said after a pause. There's a woman there, Mrs. Tilson. She takes in children sometimes. Good woman. I'll talk to her. Annie's eyes clouded. I don't want to go there. Jed got down from the horse and crouched beside her. Annie, listen. A town's got schools, other kids, a chance to be a child again. You can't get that out here with me. Her lower lip trembled. Will you come visit? He smiled, rough and weary. I reckon I will. She threw her arms around him suddenly, holding tight. Jed closed his eyes, returning the hug, feeling something deep in his chest shift, like the last piece of an old burden finally breaking loose. When she pulled away, she looked braver, stronger, the way her father must have been. By mid-afternoon they rode into Garrison. The town was small but lively, wagons creaking down the street, children running between buildings, women hanging wash in the sun. Jed found Mrs. Tilson behind the church, tending her garden. She was gray-haired and kind-eyed, the sort of woman who didn't scare easily. He explained what happened, careful not to speak Benton's name too loudly. Mrs. Tilson listened, nodding slowly. When she looked at Annie, her expression softened. She can stay here, she said simply. We'll make room. Annie glanced at Jed, uncertain. He smiled at her. Go on now. She took a step, then another, until she was standing beside Mrs. Tilson. The woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Annie looked back one last time. Jed tipped his hat. Be good, Annie. Goodbye, Mr. Lawson, she whispered. He turned and walked away before the tears could reach his eyes. As he mounted Buck, the bell from the church tower rang, steady, clear, and full of peace. Jed rode out of Garrison with the sound echoing behind him, carrying him toward the horizon. The road stretched long and empty ahead. Jed rode slowly, the sun lowering behind him, painting the plains in gold and rust. The wind carried the scent of rain and sage. It was quiet, too quiet, and that quiet gave his thoughts room to rise. He thought of Annie's face as she waved goodbye. The trust in her eyes. The way she'd clung to him, small but brave. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers who'd lost everything but still believed tomorrow might be better. He wished he could believe the same. A mile out of town, a rider came up fast from behind. Jed turned his head slightly, hand drifting toward his revolver. Dust trailed the rider like a ribbon. When the figure came close, he saw it was Sheriff Weller. Lawson, the sheriff called, reining in his horse beside him. You're a hard man to find. Jed kept his voice even. Didn't know you were looking. Weller spat to the side. Benton's dead. Took his last breath an hour after you rode off. Folks are talking, saying you murdered him in cold blood. Jed's jaw tightened. That ain't true, and you know it. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his face. I know it. But the judge won't care much about the truth. Benton had friends in high places. You best keep riding far and fast. Jed studied him, then gave a short nod. Appreciate the warning. Weller hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, that girl Annie, she's got more spirit than this whole town. You did right by her. Jed's eyes softened for the first time. She's the reason I stayed as long as I did. The sheriff tipped his hat and turned back toward town. Jed watched him go, then nudged Buck forward again. The plains opened up like an ocean before him. By dusk the wind grew cold. Clouds gathered, thick and gray. Jed stopped at a ridge overlooking Ash Hollow in the distance. From here the town looked small. Just a cluster of roofs and smoke rising slowly into the evening sky. He thought about how it had all started. One frightened little girl behind a saloon, whispering, Don't let him hurt me. He hadn't meant to stay. He never did. But something in that voice had cut through the dust and noise of all the years he'd spent running. Now the town was free of Benton's shadow. Annie was safe. But Jed knew freedom came with a cost. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small silver locket, the one Annie had dropped the night they escaped the fire. Inside was a tiny sketch of her parents drawn in careful pencil strokes. He smiled faintly, thumb tracing the edge. He'd meant to give it back to her, but maybe it was better this way. A reminder of what he'd fought for. Thunder rolled low across the hills. He pulled his coat tighter and started a small fire beneath a lone cottonwood. The flames flickered against his face, carving shadows into the lines of weariness. He spoke softly to the night, as if to someone sitting just beyond the light. "Reckon I did what I could. Maybe that's enough." The wind stirred the fire, sparks rising like lost stars. He leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Annie was sleeping safely, maybe dreaming of that house with white curtains. And for the first time in a long while, Jed felt a kind of peace settle over him, not loud or proud, but quiet, like the hush after a storm. When the fire burned low, he stood saddled buck and looked west. The horizon glowed faintly beneath a blanket of cloud. He touched the brim of his hat, whispering to no one, "Time to ride." The sound of hooves faded into the night, leaving only the wind and the crackle of dying embers behind. Morning came soft and silver. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean. Dew sparkled on the grass and thin smoke curled from the ashes of Jed's fire. He saddled Buck in silence, then mounted up, feeling the stiffness in his bones. He rode west where the sun broke through the clouds in slow golden streaks. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat, steady and sure. Hours passed before he reached the edge of a small valley. Below, a handful of cabins stood near a creek. Miners worked the earth, their shovels flashing in the light. The place looked new. Fresh lumber, young trees cut, smoke rising from cook fires. A woman stood among them, giving directions. Jed paused at the ridge, watching. It took him a moment to recognize her. Clara Monroe, the widow of one of the miners Benton had ruined. She was the one who had spoken out in the square after the showdown, the one whose voice had steadied the crowd. Now, she was leading them, men and women together, building something better from the ashes. Jed smiled faintly. "Guess they didn't need me after all," he murmured. Still, he rode down into the valley. The miners noticed him first, hands pausing on their tools. But when they saw it was Jed, no one reached for a gun. A few even nodded. Word had spread about what he'd done, what he'd risked. Clara came forward, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Lawson." He dismounted. "Just passing through." Her eyes studied him quietly. "You helped more than you know. The town's different now. Folks are standing up for themselves." Jed looked toward the creek where children were playing, laughing, splashing water on one another. One of them had Annie's same light in her eyes, the kind that believed the world could still be kind. "I'm glad," he said softly. Clara folded her arms. "You could stay, you know. We could use a man like you, someone who doesn't scare easily." He smiled a little. "Ma'am, I think you've got plenty of brave folks already. My place is out there." He nodded toward the horizon. Clara's smile was gentle, understanding. "Then you ride safe, Jed Lawson. And thank you for giving this town its soul back." He tipped his hat. "Wasn't me. We're the people. Always was." He mounted Buck and started away, the wind tugging at his coat. Behind him, the sounds of hammers and laughter rose, blending into a song of life beginning again. By noon, the valley was a small shape in the distance. Jed stopped once more at the top of a hill and looked back. The sun struck the creek, turning it into a ribbon of silver. For a moment he thought he saw Annie there, waving from beside the water, but it was only the wind moving through the reeds. He smiled, letting the memory stay. As he rode on, the land stretched wide and open, no walls, no fences, just the sound of hooves and the whisper of the wind. The pain in his chest had eased, replaced by something steadier. Not joy, not sorrow, peace. He thought of Annie's words that day. "You didn't just stop him. You changed everything." Maybe she was right. Maybe changing everything didn't mean staying. Sometimes it meant leaving something good behind. The sun dipped low, turning the sky to fire. Jed rode toward it, his shadow long across the plain. When night fell, the first stars came out, bright, steady, endless. He tipped his hat to them like old friends and kept riding west where the horizon never ended. Somewhere behind him, in a little valley by the creek, a new town was growing. Somewhere a girl named Annie was safe. And somewhere, deep in the heart of a man who had lost nearly everything, hope still burned, quiet, but alive. If this story touched your heart, don't write off just yet. Hit like to let more folks find it, and subscribe for more Wild West tales of courage, redemption, and the kind of love that never quits. There's another story waiting down the trail, and you don't want to miss it.